A forest is such a serene place. Nothing like heading out to a trail to get back to nature and soak in all that fresh air. And we're kicking off this video with stairs. This is something that a lot of you have probably heard of before. There have been many stories and images surfacing online of people, as well as park rangers, coming across stairs in the middle of the forest, leading to some pretty surreal, haunting kind of images. These stairs are often found deep in the woods and can be made of a variety of materials, including concrete and wood. The stairs appear to have been constructed by human hands and appear to be in rather good condition, even though they are often located in areas where there are no buildings or signs of human activity. A supposed paranormal stories surrounding these stairs suggest that they are haunted or cursed, and that those who climb them are doomed to a terrible fate. Some claim that the stairs are remnants of long abandoned structures, while others believe that they are portals to other dimensions or the work of supernatural entities. And I gotta say, I mean, just seeing stairs in the middle of a forest, that would be pretty eerie for me too. I'd be just a little bit freaked out. The search for the missing teens. Reddit user Genesis Pro Tech shared this story. There had been a group of teenagers who went on a camping trip but did not return at the scheduled time. Worried about their safety, Genesis Pro Tech and his good friend, along with a search and rescue professional who knew the area well, were called to assist with the search efforts. After hiking for most of the day and covering about 35 kilometers into the woods, the search party began to notice some strange things. They came across sticks that were carved into spears and stuck in the ground, odd carvings on the trees, and a child's stuffed animal hanging from a tree. These items were all freshly carved, indicating that someone had been in the area recently. The thing is, this wasn't on any of the regular trails in the area, and it was far from any roads. Despite their growing unease, the search party continued to hike through the woods, hoping to find the missing teenagers. As night fell, they set up camp, still on edge from the unsettling things they'd seen earlier, and after a restless night, they woke up at dawn and prepared to continue the search. While packing up the gear though, they found a piece of ripped clothing and some shoe prints nearby. They thought, hey, maybe they were close to finding the missing teens. But then they received a radio call that the teenagers had been found about 20 kilometers away to the east, and that they were calling the search party back. They were pretty relieved about the teens being found, but understandably shaken at the same time. What was all that stuff they'd come across in the middle of nowhere? Next up we have stalked by a cougar. A Redditor by the name of Smokey the Marshmallow shared what they described as the scariest incident they had experienced as a park ranger. In Washington state, the ranger had been hiking up an unpopular trail leading to an old shelter where he had a strange feeling he was being watched. Although he had seen fresh cougar scratches and droppings along the trail, which were common in the area, he wasn't worried at first. That night, he camped at the shelter, which had only 3 walls and a roof. He felt a little uneasy throughout the night and didn't sleep much. In an attempt to feel safer, he arranged his emergency foil tarp around his sleeping bag, hoping to hear something if it approached him as he slept. The next day, the ranger found fresh cougar droppings and scratches on the trail he had hiked on. He continued on the trail and found a mostly eaten deer and some dense brush just off the trail. This was an indication that this cougar was nearby, and the ranger began to feel pretty uneasy, as you could probably imagine, given he was at least 13 miles away from civilization. As a result, he decided to just shorten his 3-day trip and quickly made his way out of the area. Probably a smart idea. Badlands National Park, located in South Dakota, is considered to be one of the most haunted places in the United States. Many visitors and park rangers have reported paranormal activities in the park, including ghostly sightings and eerie sounds. The area is known for its rugged terrain, deep canyons, and eroded rock formations, which have become the perfect setting for various ghost stories. It is also home to a dark history of violence and tragedy, leading to many rumors of possible paranormal activity. The area was once a haven for outlaws and bandits as well, who would often take refuge in the rugged landscape. It's rumored that the spirits of these notorious criminals still haunt the park, with visitors reporting strange noises, apparitions, and just feelings of being watched. Visitors have also reported strange lights and unexplained sounds and eerie shadows within the park. The Deer Head. A ranger at Yellowstone National Park posted the following story on Reddit. They stated that they had been exploring the remote Lamar Valley, situated miles away from the nearest road and the park boundary. While wandering on the trail, the ranger came across a bizarre sight: a perfectly severed deer head in the middle of the path. There was no evidence of blood, and the head seemed to be untouched and intact. The person had previously come across the kills of bears and wolves, and even tracked the kills of cougars in South Dakota, but this was something else entirely. The head was of a doe and didn't have antlers, so kind of unlikely that it was a hunter committed this act, and it makes sense for someone to even leave the head in the middle of the trail. Just a perfectly severed, intact head. Yeah. Pretty weird. Next up, we have the booby trap. In April 2012, a U.S. Forest Service law enforcement officer named James Schaufler was on patrol in a popular recreation area located off Big Springs Trail in Provo Canyon, Utah. While on foot, he came across what looked to be a tripwire, and to his horror, he discovered a primitive booby trap that was set to activate when said tripwire was crossed. The device was made of a large rock and had sharpened sticks on it, forming kind of like a spiked ball that of course could have hit an unsuspecting person and caused some serious harm. After dismantling the trap, he found another tripwire designed to send someone falling into a bed of sharpened wooden spikes, very Mortal Kombat style. Schaufler's quick thinking and sharp eyesight prevented a potentially very serious incident from happening, as the booby traps were located only half a mile from the recreation area's parking lot. It was fortunate that no one was injured, especially since there was a child's birthday party being held in the area at the time. Yikes. The traps were dismantled, and Schaufler's actions were instrumental, obviously, in keeping people safe while enjoying the area's natural beauty. Thank you, James. The next story comes from us to another Reddit user, Shiny Brian, who picked quite the spot to relieve himself. He had a job fighting forest fires in the Pacific Northwest and described his scariest encounter as such. My scariest wilderness encounter was about 2 a.m. while maintaining a fire line on a 300-acre fire caused by a lightning strike. I needed to take a number one, and the rule is you don't take a number one on the fire. So I walked over towards a stump outside the fire line. I was about 50 feet away from the stump when it walked away. It was a black bear. I feel like I would have just shrunk into myself if this ever happened to me. I mean, just seeing a stump you were looking at move, first of all, is scary, and then to see it's a bear, yeah, no thanks. All right, Lake Crescent in Olympic National Park is steeped in legend and ghost stories. One of the most popular legends surrounding the lake is that it was created when part of Mount Storm King fell onto a battlefield, crushing the combatants and creating the bed of the lake, according to legend anyway. However, a more recent and factual story is that of the Lady of the Lake. In 1940, the body of a woman was found floating in the lake. Her body was eerily well preserved, likely due to the natural process of saponification, which gave her skin a kind of waxy texture. The woman was later identified Haley Latham Illingworth, a local tavern server who had disappeared in 1937. Her husband, Monty, was identified as the culprit after authorities found strangulation bruises on her body. Despite the mystery being solved, though, visitors to the area still report seeing the ghost of her lingering on the shores of Lake Crescent, making it one of Washington's most haunted trails, supposedly. Next up, we have the bear attack. Jordan Carberry, a Canadian park ranger in Bella Coola, British Columbia, had come across some bear cubs in a tree. Never a good sign. You do not want to come across grizzly bear cubs in the wild, as cute as they are, because where they are, the mother is close by, and she does not want to see you. And this was no exception. One of these cubs happened to fall out of the tree and caught the attention of the protective mother bear, who began charging towards him. The grizzly bear tackled him from behind, picked him up by his head. Bear then picked him up again by his thigh and dropped him down repeatedly. Using what he had learned from a defensive training class, though, the park ranger, Carberry, kicked the bear in the face as hard as he could and managed to create enough space to run back to his house. Since he didn't have cell service though, Carberry actually had to drive himself to the hospital with one arm over his belly, just telling himself repeatedly not to pass out. Despite his injuries, Carberry did recover, and during recovery was quoted as saying he felt fan-freaking-tastic. So amazing. The last story here, this is a personal story, at least one that happened to a buddy of mine. I call it the Waving Man. So my buddy used to be a camp counselor. So yeah, not a park ranger, but hey, close enough. Anyway, he took kids out on portaging trips. It used to be like days-long trips. We'd canoe, and then you'd, traverse through the forest with the canoe, and then you'd canoe again. That's what it's called. Anyway, so one day they're canoeing, they're getting to their next site, and they happen across this man on the side of the shore, and he's kind of asking my buddy, hey, where are you guys camping and all this stuff? And my buddy Max, he doesn't really tell him because obviously he's got kids with him. He doesn't want some guy coming around their campsite. But they make it to their campsite that night. They set up the fire, they set up their tents. The kids go to bed. Him and his fellow camp counselor are in their tent. And then they start to hear what sounds like footsteps kind of walking around their campsite. And they're thinking like, okay, maybe it's one of the kids who's up or something like that. Unzip their tent. Nobody. Totally empty campsite. Now they're obviously a little bit freaked out, right? Zip up the tent again. They hear those footsteps once again. They're like, do you hear that? Yeah, like I hear there's something. And keep in mind, they got kids with them. So they have to, obviously protect the kids. My buddy Max pulls out an axe he had with them, set up a fire, and they just stay up all night, just waiting for whoever this is to come out or, might have to use that axe. They were really freaked out. Anyway, night goes by fine, no one ends up showing up. Head back on their canoes the next morning, and as they're heading down the river, they see that same man they met the day before just on the side of the shore, just waving and smiling at them. So, I don't know. Anyway.
Starting off this countdown, we have the deer head. Posted on Reddit by RipeOTCDXVI, they claim to be a forest ranger at Yellowstone National Park. One day they were out exploring a part of the park called Lamar Valley, which is about 11 miles from the nearest road. While on the trail, they stumbled upon something very shocking. A perfectly severed deer head. There was no blood whatsoever, and it was cut off with precision. Now obviously, since this is a park, rangers come across dead animals all the time, but never in such perfect condition. Also, the head was completely uneaten. So now the question is, who did this? Why did they do this? How did they do this? Moving on to number 9, we have the abandoned tent. Reddit user Not So Single Buck was at work one day when he came across a campsite that was set outside of the designated campsite area, which is against the rules of the park, so he went to investigate. In the tent, he found a sleeping bag, some dirty clothes, lots of canned food, and a teddy bear. The whole tent smelled of cigarette smoke. There was nothing that he could do though until the individual returned. He didn't want to wait all day, so he just took the open food to prevent animals from being attracted to it and left a note explaining where he had taken the food and why. 2 weeks later, he returned to the tent and it had remained untouched. As a result, him and his team cleared out the tent. Whatever happened to the person staying in the tent remains a huge mystery. Did a wild animal get to them? Did they fall off a cliff? A body was never found, so we may never know. Coming in at number 8, we have the wolf pack. This story happened 3 years ago by an old-timey forest ranger that worked in Montana. He was out roaming around on his ATV when he saw an older lady in the distance. She was screaming as 6 wolves closed in around her. The ranger drove down to her as fast as he could, yelling and honking, trying to scare away the wolves. But when he got there, she was nowhere to be found. The only sign of her was a single ring with a black stone which was on the ground where the woman was standing. Seems like the wolves got to her and carried her away. Coming in at number 7, we have the strange blue lights. This person used to work as a ranger at Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico. There's a place on this ranch that is said to be haunted. There's a number of urban legends surrounding this place, like, oh, it's the portal to the underworld, or it's home to an ancient cursed burial ground, you get it. There's also this very eerie legend saying that on some nights, blue lights can be seen. One story claims that a hiker saw an eerie figure on the trail. The figure was tall and emitting a blue light. Well, legend goes that the blue lights are coming from a shaman that guards the ground. Anyways, obviously these are just legends, right? Well, one night the ranger was out with a scout troop when they saw a bunch of weird lights coming from a trail. These were the infamous blue lights talked about in multiple legends. Everyone was so freaked out that they got out of there as fast as they could. Now, let's just say that they're all believers. In our sixth spot, we have these skinned animals. So a couple of years ago, 2 forest rangers were on their way to a far location when it got dark out. As a result, they had to camp overnight. But during the night, they were woken up by the sound of footsteps right outside of their tent. All of a sudden, they heard a number of people yell, "Get out!" The 2 rangers packed up as fast as they could and got the hell out of there. The next morning, the cops went to check out the area and found 4 skinned animals nailed to the trees surrounding their campsite. Okay, that is horrifying, and I have a number of questions. Number 1, who the heck were these people? Number 2, what were they doing there? Number 3, what the heck? And number 4, what the heck? Seriously, that is so messed up. Were they doing some satanic ritual and the forest rangers ruined it, or what? We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the Wendigo. Imagine going out camping with some friends and encountering a Wendigo during your trip. Wouldn't that be insane and terrifying? Like if you agree. Well, this happened to a forest ranger and a bunch of his friends. So the group went out camping and all was going well. Until the second night. During the night, all 4 of the men woke up to a loud, high-pitched scream. They assumed it was just the coyote. But the next morning, they were in for a surprise. By their campsite, they found a bunch of animal guts everywhere. The ranger described it as if there was a bomb in an animal and then it went off. There was just fur, blood, and flesh everywhere. That night is when they came across the monster that devoured the animal. They were out investigating a sound when they saw a weird tall figure move in the distance. It was about 6 feet tall and did not look like an animal and did not look like a human. When the creature spotted the men, it took off in a flash. They believe that they encountered a Wendigo. Coming in at number 4, we have the man in the woods. This next individual was a park ranger on a small island. The island could only be accessed by a private boat. During the summer, there would be hordes of people there, but during the off-season, the ranger would be the only one on the island. One night, the ranger decided to take a hike around the entire island. Yeah, at night, when it's dark. He thought it would be a fun challenge for himself. Plus, there was no cell or internet service, so you know, what else could you really do? While he was out on his hike, he heard a noise coming from behind him. He turned around and standing behind him was a crazy old man. He was a super pale and super tall man with dark hair. The man gave out a creepy smile and then cackled. The ranger ran for his life and this crazy man ran after him until the ranger made it back safely to his cabin. In the morning, he went back on the trail he had been on, and there were no sets of other footprints, only his own, as if the man had never been there at all. Moving on at number 3, we have the polar bears. So this next individual was a park ranger in the northern part of Ontario, Canada. In the middle of the night, she woke up to hear something outside of her tent. She opened her eyes and saw the head of a polar bear peeking into her tent. Imagine waking up and seeing that thing breathing in your face. Like, what would you do? Well, the correct answer is don't panic and don't frighten the bear. Thankfully, that's what the ranger did. She stayed calm and eventually the bear left the tent. That could have ended much worse for this woman. She got lucky. Like, I think I would have peed myself, seriously. In our second spot, we have the river accident. A man named Kevin Uxbridge used to be a ranger at Yosemite. One day, he was making his way through the gate, which was along a river, when he heard a huge commotion. People were yelling and screaming and crying. Well, turns out there was a husband and wife standing by the river. The husband was taking a picture of his wife and kept telling her to back up, you know, so he could get a good shot. Well, she ended up backing up too far and she fell into the river. The river was pretty violent that day, so within seconds she was swept under. It took the ranger and firefighters 2 months before they could find her body. The worst part? Her body was found in the swimming hole when the river had settled. People were swimming in there just days before they found her. And in our number 1 spot, we have the ghostly body. This next story comes from a trail ranger. One time, he noticed that there was a bunch of illegally placed wildlife cameras around, so he went around taking them down. Things were going well until he started hearing a bunch of weird voices. He hopped back on his ATV, but the battery was disconnected, so he couldn't drive off. He was then stuck there waiting for someone to pick him up. They were an hour away and it was getting dark. He decided to sit down and make a small fire. Before he knew it, the voices were back, this time getting louder and louder. Finally, he could hear what was being said. It was two hunters arguing over a kill. That's when all of a sudden he heard a loud bang. It was a gunshot. After that, he smothered the fire and hid until his coworkers arrived. The next day, the two came back with the police to investigate the area. After about an hour of looking, they came across a shallow grave. In it, they found a dead man who had been shot in the face. The freakiest part? It was just the skeleton of the man. He had been there for years. So it seems like he heard ghosts reenacting the murder that happened years ago or something like that. Starting off this countdown, we have the missing hunter. In December of 2020, a 45-year-old hunter was deemed missing after not returning from an afternoon hunt. Two rangers were sent out into the forest to go look for this man. All throughout the night on December 4th, the rangers looked for him. They found tracks and some personal items left by this hunter, but the hunter himself was nowhere to be found. Early in the morning, they were joined by 4 more rangers to help search through the thick and swampy forest. Just after 3:03 p.m., the hunter was found. Sadly, not alive. He was found in Shaker Mountain Wild Forest. The cause of death is still unknown. Everyone was hoping that this wasn't going to be the outcome. But sadly, what they feared the most came true. In our 9th spot today, we have the aliens. This forest ranger almost got beamed up by a damn UFO spacecraft. Sounds crazy, right? Let me explain. So it was the middle of the night and the ranger was in his cabin chilling when all of a sudden he heard this weird electronic sound coming from outside. He described it as a mixture of TV static and a high-pitched ringing sound. He followed the sound to the middle of the woods and all of a sudden he was surrounded by this bright blue light. He says it was so blinding that he could barely see. He looked up and swore he saw a big silver craft hovering above him. He was so scared he ran back to his cabin and locked himself inside. The light stayed in the spot in the woods for a couple of minutes before disappearing. So like, what is that? That for sure had to be aliens, right? Coming in at number 8, we have the creepy stranger. And if you guys are liking this video so far and want to see more spooky content, then smash that like button. One forest ranger told a time he was leading a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. He was with 8 middle school kids and 1 co-instructor. Once they reached the top of the mountain, they settled down for the night. He decided to spend the night in a hammock since it was so nice out. That night though, around 10:30 p.m., he saw something approach the campsite. As it got closer, he saw that it was a person. Now, they were in the middle of nowhere, so it was weird for people to be up there. Apparently, this person just stood there watching the camp for 30 minutes. And then he sat down under a tree facing the camp, just staring. The man stayed there until 3:30 a.m. That's when he got up, surveyed the camp one last time, and then left. Okay, what the heck? Like, what was this dude doing? Was he waiting for the ranger to fall asleep so that he could attack? Was it even a human, or was it a humanoid creature disguising themselves as a human, okay? These are the questions that we need answers to, people. In our 7th spot, we have the humanoid creature. Speaking of humanoid creatures, the forest ranger in this next story might have really encountered one. This happened a number of years ago in Fishkill, New York. According to the ranger, the area that they were in was quite isolated in the woods. You have a bunch of cabins on top of a mountain, but each cabin is like half a mile apart from each other. One night at 1 a.m., he was cutting through the woods to get to his girlfriend's cabin when he heard a weird rustling coming from the woods. He was expecting it to be a bear or other creature, but what he saw was far more frightening. A 3-foot-tall humanoid creature jumped out of the bushes and just stared at him. It was standing on its 2 feet and it had 2 arms, but it definitely did not look like a person. He tried to get closer to get a better look at it, but that's when it took off. He said that the way that it ran was very odd. It was very mechanical moving and ran super fast. To this day, he still doesn't know what it is that he saw. So I'm gonna go with a lost house elf because his description just reminds me of Dobby from Harry Potter. In our 6th spot, we have the missing friends. This forest ranger shared the time he was sent out to look for a group of missing teens. They were out camping, but they never returned home. So this forest ranger and another went out in the general direction the teens were camping in. They were about 35 kilometers deep into the woods when they started noticing some odd things, like sticks carved like spears sticking out of the ground, creepy things carved into trees, and stuffed animals hanging by nooses up in the trees. Everything was freshly carved, meaning someone had just been there and done that. so that means they were lurking around there somewhere close. They kept on hiking until it was dark and settled down until the next day. That next morning, they noticed a bunch of ripped clothing and shoe prints. They thought, okay, maybe the group of teens were nearby, but just then they got a call on the radio saying that the teens had been found. So now, here's what he's wondering. Who did the ripped clothing and footprints belong to? And who created that creepy, weird shrine they encountered the day before? Coming in at number 5, we have the lost campers. A couple of years ago, this forest ranger was out practicing winter climbing when he came across a tent in the middle of nowhere. He got closer to it and found it had been ripped open, and it was badly faded from the sun. He crawled inside and found the typical camping stuff: sleeping bag, clothes, dried food, etc. But he also found a newspaper in there dated from 5 years ago. This tent had been up there for 5 years. Who knows what happened to whoever was staying in there? Isn't that creepy? Moving on, at number 4, we have the witch. According to this user, his grandfather used to be the equivalent to a mountain ranger down in Mexico. Well, one night he was out patrolling when he heard the sounds of a baby crying. He looked around but couldn't see anything, so he followed the sound of the crying. This is when it gets wild, people. He's walking towards the sound when all of a sudden something flies up into the air and then towards the mountains. He is adamant that it was a witch. He panicked and ran the opposite direction and got in his car and got out of there as fast as he could. Smart man. Coming in at number 3, we have the cage. Okay, this one is super freaky, but a forest ranger was out patrolling the area when they came across a big cage with a full-sized mattress in it. The cage also had a container for water and some canned food, as if they were keeping a person captive inside. Yeah, not an animal, a human. The worst part, the mattress was heavily stained with what looked like blood. Dude, what the heck? Who was in that cage and what happened to them and why were they being held captive? I need to know. In our second spot today, we have the search and rescue. This next park ranger was called in to help locate a missing man in his 20s. He had gone hiking and never returned home. Now, when he got the call about this disappearance, it was nighttime, which makes everything a whole lot harder, but also creepier. So he hiked a few miles and then set up camp when it became really late. At around 2 a.m., he woke up to go to the bathroom when he saw a moving light at the base of a cliff. It looked like someone was flashing their flashlight at him. So the next morning, he set off in that direction. As soon as they got there, they saw the missing man's body at the end of the cliff. He had fallen 60 feet down. Here's the creepy part. The coroner arrived and said that the man had been dead there for 48 hours. So, who was out there shining that flashlight then? Did somebody dispose of his body off of the cliff that night? Or was it the man's ghost helping the rangers locate his body? Either way, I got the chills. And in our number 1 spot today, we have the thumb. This story, by far, is the scariest one on this list, but it's also the shortest one. Posted on Reddit by user Homeless Homie, he said, and I quote, "I saw a human thumb nailed to a tree." That one sentence is chilling. For starters, whose thumb does that belong to? Where is that person? What happened? And then who nailed his thumb to the tree? Okay, that is so unnerving and unsettling. And that's all the details he left us with, so we don't know if they ever solved this creepy mystery.
Number 10. Abandoned car. A desert park ranger on Reddit shared a few of their stories that they had experienced while working. One that stands out is their discovery of a burned and abandoned car. When they received the report, they weren't too shocked, as it wasn't a rare occurrence that cars would be stolen and abandoned, occasionally being burned. When they found the vehicle, and as they waited for the fire department to arrive, they were left standing in shock, as it was clear that there was a body left in the front seat of the car. They discovered rope and other strange items in the car, and it was determined that the body had been tied up and killed. The police arrived, but no answers ever came about what had happened there, and they now refer to the area as the haunted site. Number 9. Abandoned sites. It's not uncommon to find abandoned campsites in the woods, but these rangers share their stories of the unique, strange, and scary things they found that made them stand out. The first was an abandoned house with a small shed hidden behind it. The shed had a large steel door which had been broken off its hinges when they found it. The windows had been boarded over and covered up, but venturing inside, they found only a queen-sized bed covered with burned sheets. The next was an abandoned tent found very close to the walking trail. Inside was a large stash of food like beans and rice, a sleeping bag, and a lonely teddy bear. Sometimes the stories with the least information and answers are scariest, as they allow our minds to wander and imagine various frightening scenarios. Number 8. Search returns strange evidence. A ranger and their coworker were called to head out and search for a group of teen hikers that had become separated from their group. They spent most of their day heading in the direction of where the teenagers had last been seen. Eventually, deep into the woods and their journey, they came across a startling discovery. They found branches which had been carved into spears placed into the ground, unidentifiable carvings in trees, children's stuffed toys hanging from ropes tied to the trees. One thing they noticed was that the symbols in the trees appeared to be freshly carved. As would be expected, the two were spooked, but settled down nearby as night was coming and they had to sleep. In the morning, they discovered shoe prints and a piece of fabric that had become caught on a tree. Someone had been there in the night. The teens were later discovered and the two workers returned back to base, never knowing who had been in the woods with them that night. Number 7. Strange creature. A camp counselor in New York made a scary discovery when he was sneaking out late at night to meet up with his girlfriend. It was about 1 a.m. when he heard rustling in the woods next to him, expecting to be faced with something like a bear, deer, or other wild animal. Unexpectedly, a creature burst forth from the bushes towards him. In the darkness, he described the creature's appearance as being 3 feet tall, standing on 2 legs, and having 2 arms, looking like a miniature person. While it can be easy to misidentify animals in the dark of night, I personally can't think of any normal forest creature that would match anything close to this description. He then moved towards it and it apparently got scared, running away in a strange manner that the camp counselor described as being similar to doing the robot dance. To this day, he has no idea what the creature might have been. Number 6. Light on the cliff. An unfortunate part of being a park ranger is having to go on search and rescue missions for missing people, and never knowing what state you might find them in, if at all. One park ranger recounts a story of him and his coworker on one of these calls, searching for a man in his 20s who had gone missing. As they spent the day searching with no luck, they decided to set up a camp and rest for the night. At about 2 a.m., he got up to go to the bathroom when he spotted a bright light moving on a cliff a few miles away, saying it looked to be like a flashlight beam. In the morning, they went to search that area and unfortunately found the missing man's body at the base of the cliff. What caught the ranger's attention was a flashlight, similar to the one he thought he had seen on the cliff. So it seems to make sense. The man had been walking with his flashlight and had unfortunately fallen. But it doesn't end there. When the coroner arrived to inspect the body, it was determined the man had clearly been dead for over 48 hours. So how could it have been him shining his flashlight on the cliff the night before? Apparently, another search and rescue team member had been near the area and hadn't seen any other people. To this day, there seems to be no explanation for what that light was. Number 5. Burned mannequins. Another park ranger on Reddit shared his experience while working at a national wildlife refuge that had formerly been home to a US Army Labs site. The site had been completely transformed to become a wildlife refuge, with years of thorough cleanup needing to be done on things like barbed wire fences and barricades before it could be opened. One night, when the ranger was walking deep into the forest, he saw figures in the distance. This caught him off guard, as you're not permitted to leave the trails at all. So who was out there? The ranger announced himself and moved closer, and what he discovered was 6 mannequins in military uniforms, which appeared to have been badly burnt. 6 burned figures standing around in the woods in the dark of night would have been scary for anyone to stumble upon, though apparently he chalked it up to having been part of a fabric test. Still pretty scary to discover though, and to think it was somehow missed in the decade-long cleanup of the park. Number 4. Only resident. A park ranger for a small island was the only year-round resident of the area. The island had no bridges or ferries and could only be accessed by private boats. The island would be crowded in the summer, but in the off-season, the island was only inhabited by the ranger. Walking at night, he was adventuring around the island, seeing if he could hike the entire distance. He saw a flash of white in the distance, thinking it was a herd of the brown and white deer which were local to the area. He pressed forward, before hearing something move again. Suddenly, out of the woods came a 6-foot-tall man wearing a bright white shirt. He sprinted straight up to the ranger with a strange grin on his face before shouting and laughing loudly, quickly sprinting back into the woods again. The ranger was rightfully terrified because, as far as he knew, he was the only person on the small island. For the next few days, he tried to find any evidence of another person living on the island, but never found any campsite, boat, or other signs of life. Number 3. Mysterious stranger. A ranger was leading a hiking trip to the top of a mountain in North Carolina, a difficult hike far from any civilization. When they reached the peak, they set up a camp on a beautiful clear night. Since it was so nice out, after the group had gone to bed in their tents, the ranger chose to sleep outside in a hammock, reading a book to pass the time. Due to the brightness of the camp and the moon, it was easy for them to see around the camp and the trail that they had taken to get there. They were soon caught off guard by the sight of something moving, expecting it to be a bear. But as they got closer, they realized it was the shape of a person. They found it odd to see someone at the top of the difficult and long trail at night with no light or any sign of gear. They watched the person move closer towards the camp before the figure stopped, staring out at the camp. The figure stood there for a while before moving to sit under a tree, still staring intently. The ranger watched the man sit there for what was apparently a few hours before the figure got up and made his way back down to the trail. This left the poor ranger with a paranoid feeling of being followed for the remainder of the trip. Number 2. Deer head. It's not uncommon to find animals or animal remains in the woods, circle of life and all that. But a Yellowstone ranger described their very bizarre experience which occurred near a valley deep into the park. While walking a trail, they found in the middle of the path the head of a deer. What was strange was that the head was perfectly clean, no sign of blood and no sign of an animal having tried to eat it. The ranger didn't find any other signs of other animals that may have been around the area and done this. They also had no explanation for why a human may have done this, as it was a doe with no antlers that a hunter may want to collect. The experience left the ranger shaking and desperately trying to come up with an explanation for the bizarre and shocking discovery, but none could be found. Number 1. Skin changer. One wildland firefighter shares a story that his supervisor had told him many times. Apparently, in Idaho, the crew had been working on a large fire incident and would have to be there through the night in order to deal with it. The supervisor went out on an ATV to get a look at the nearby area when a large cat, seemingly a bobcat, ran out into the road. The animal stood there and stared at him for a while, before letting out a loud scream and running up a tree nearby the road. While startling, it didn't appear to be any reason for concern. Further down the road, he discovered an abandoned cabin. This was also strange as the land was federal property and there should be no buildings. The house appeared derelict and was boarded up, everything inside appearing incredibly out of order. Unsettled, the supervisor got back on his ATV to head back, but at the exact same place where he had seen the bobcat, a woman stood in the road with a nightgown and bare feet. He asked if she needed help, to which she responded with a scream, before running up the same tree the bobcat had, faster than any human would be able to. After returning, he asked locals about the cabin in the area, recounting his experience, to which they told him that he had likely had an encounter with a skin changer.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Through Him. This one comes from Reddit user SuperDan23. Now I thought I'd start off with a really strong one, hopefully this doesn't creep you guys out too much. SuperDan said, I worked at a summer camp where the cabins were arranged in a circle, a center building that was used for showers and bathrooms. One night, one of my campers, about 12 years old, asked to go to the bathroom, just as we had all gotten into bed. I tell him to take his bunkmate and to go quickly. The bathroom building is about 100 feet away. The kids are kind of dorking around like kids do, and they take off for the bathroom running. All of a sudden I hear screams that still haunt me. Hysterical, choking for air, horror movie screams. I jump up and run out, and I see the two boys sitting on the ground right outside the bathrooms, and they are kind of holding each other. After a few minutes they calm down enough and they say they ran through a man. They say he appeared right before they got to the bathroom door and was standing in the doorway. They didn't have enough space to stop, and when they put their hands up they went through him and into the door. They said there was cold air around him and that was it. He was gone. They said he had a suit on and slicked black hair and was smiling. We had to call the parents and they both went home the next morning. No kid goes home from summer camp, man. It still freaks me out. Next up at number 9 now we have Good Bones. Now this is a short one, but it's packed with just as much creepiness as the rest of our stories in today's video. It comes from Reddit user The Copy Paste Life. They said, our park lets kids from school in so they can look for animals in the forest and the streams. One day a kid finds molars. The teeth look like human molars, but the teacher said it was a deer's. I dismissed it and completely forgot about it. 2 days later they found a corpse with a smashed skull and jaw in another part of the park. All of its teeth were missing. Local newspaper covered the story, but all they had to say was, thank the spooky skeletons for good bones and teeth. Okay, so with that story, the bones and teeth and the skull were all creepy, but do you know what else is creepy? That newspaper. Who hears about a potential murder victim and jokes about spooky skeletons? That is really creepy. I'm just saying. Moving on to number 8 now, we have Womp. This one was posted to Reddit by OG Dinosaur. Now he admits that he's not a ranger, but rather an archaeologist who heads out to the wilderness to do studies, but in my opinion his story is too good to miss out. He said, a few years back we were doing a massive survey in the middle of nowhere in the interior of BC. All the crew had gone home and it was just my boss and myself left for a few days to follow up and confirm some coordinates and finish some mapping. We head out from the motel an hour or so into the bush, middle of nowhere, along deactivated logging roads. Closest town is miles and miles away. We hike out to this one area we had found a site at a few weeks previously. Now for some reason the whole area just felt off. So we get down to business, and about 15 minutes after being hunched over mapping, there is this weird, deafening whomp sound. Like I could feel pressure in my ears. I immediately looked at my boss about 20 feet away, and he is white as a ghost staring back at me. Standing there, it happens again. Whomp. Ear pressure and chest pressure, like I was just squeezed. Chills all over my body and every hair is standing on end. My boss just looks at me and says, let's go. We grab all of our stuff and speed hike back to the truck. We never discussed it again. No clue what it was, but I have never been so freaked out in my life. 10 years later and I still get the chills. Moving on to number 7 now, we have Black Magic. This one comes from Reddit user Rooston Dayard. It's about to step up a gear here, guys. She said, I was a ranger at a coastal park in South Carolina, down on the islands. I saw the aftermath of some truly creepy black magic. When you open the park, you must also begin with a complete park tour, including riding down the beach. Several times in the 2 years I worked there, I came across turkeys chained up and chickens left in homemade crates for the high tide to come in and kill. Strange artifacts would always be scattered around the crest of where high tide hit. Everything from random bones to swatches of clothing could be found. Half the staff that worked there were Gula. They would tell me that was black magic, not to be confused with root magic. Black magic would be the bad kind, where you have to sacrifice life and are asking for something bad to happen. Root magic is a good magic, where you're just asking for love, health, luck, etc., and not sacrificing a life. It always freaked me out seeing it and bummed me out to clean it up. Next up at number 6 now, we have the jungle spirit. Now do you guys believe in the spirits living in trees? If you don't, you might find this one interesting. It comes from Reddit user Morgan Explosion, who said, I was working at a survey station deep in the Malaysian jungle in Borneo, 4 hours in 4x4s to reach this spot from the nearest village. I was sleeping in one of the dorms with some of the rangers we were working with, 5 people total in the dorm. That night, I was having a nightmare and woke up at about 2 AM to the sound of footsteps outside. Whatever it was fairly big and sounded bipedal. It stopped right outside the window, so I'm staring back at the window trying hard to see. It was pitch black in the whole station since it runs on solar power and the batteries give out around midnight. Suddenly, one of the rangers shifted in her bed, making a noise, and I could hear whatever it was running away quite fast. Being a rather skeptical person in general, I woke up and asked the rangers the next day about it. They adamantly believed that it was a jungle spirit coming to check us out. The station stood on stilts, so the window sits about 10 feet off the ground. I asked about the possibility of it being a wild animal, but they said the only thing big enough to make that large of a footprint would have been a sun bear or a cloud leopard. They said it's generally unheard of for those animals to make it that close to the survey station, since there are usually people milling about. The rangers have heard the footsteps before, and they firmly believe that a jungle spirit was roaming about the site. Moving on to number 5 now, we have missing teens. This one comes from Jennifer Genesis Pro Tech, this story is a reminder to not always jump to conclusions. They said there was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return time from a camping trip. A good friend and I knew the area very well, so one of the search team and rescue guys we're friends with called us in to assist in the search. Him and I head out in the general direction the teens had set off in. We'd been hiking for almost a day and we'd seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we start noticing odd things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings on the trees, a child's stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't even on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for these teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night, still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settle down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more ground before it gets too hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go when I noticed a bit of shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close to the teens, when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us, and they're calling everybody back from the search. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind. We wasted no time hiking out of those woods. Next up at number 4 now, we have the crowbar. This one came from Reddit user Tinge of the Ginge, which is a great name, I must say. This one sounds more like an actual horror movie though. They said, I'm a field biologist and my job takes me to some fairly remote places. I have 2 favorite stories. The first was the time I was surveying a remote restoration site near an old trail and heard someone walking up a nearby path. All the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, so I grabbed all my stuff and started casually walking down the trail like I belonged there. I turned the corner and there was a shirtless guy swinging a crowbar around in circles, and when he saw me he started yelling, "I've got a crowbar, I've got a crowbar." I think I nodded at him, squeaked something like "nice crowbar," and then ran the mile or so back to my truck. And that's the reason why I always carry mace and a big knife now. Moving on to number 3 now, we have the head. This one comes from Reddit user RipeOTCDXVI. They're actually a ranger at Yellowstone National Park. That's the one that looks amazing, but it could blow up at any moment and end humanity. Yeah, that one. Anyway, they said, a couple weeks ago I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road and even further to the park boundary. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, no raggedness at the severance, perfectly intact. Now this is weird because I have seen wolf and bear kills and I used to find cougar kills in SD with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any of those things. This head was completely uneaten. Eyes, tongue, everything was intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. No catching, no scat, right in the middle of the trail, but again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers, plus why leave it in the trail? The whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the path. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the howling. This one comes from Reddit user Jack Mac. He said, I have seen weird lights, heard weird sounds, found weird stuff in the woods before, but the one that sticks out was years ago. I was camping at a friend's property in South Texas. I am asleep in my tent and all of a sudden I wake up in the middle of the night. One of those from dead sleep to wide awake in half a second moments. I can feel something outside the tent, but I don't want to look. I have considerable camping, hiking experience, so I'm not freaking out too badly. I very slowly unzip the top of the tent, being as quiet as I can. I look out of the tent and there is very little light. We were camped under a giant oak tree, so big the branches dipped down and connected with the ground before growing back up again. It is a huge tree and there are lots of shadows and weird shapes. Anyway, as my eyes start to adjust, I realize there are about 40 or more coyotes all milling around the campsite, just slowly walking around, sniffing here and there, almost ghost-like in their quietness. I slowly zipped the flap back up and laid there for about 30 minutes before I fell back to sleep. In the morning, in the light, You couldn't tell anything had been there. The next night we heard the pack howling for hours in the distance. That was almost freakier than seeing them 10 feet away. And finally, number 1 now, we have Burnt. This one comes from Reddit user Beer and Oxytocin. It's pretty grim, so maybe skip this last one if you're very squeamish. They said, I'm a ranger, a non-peace officer, and I work at a pretty remote desert park. This happened before I got there, but the other rangers I work with were there. They went to do a patrol during summer, our off season, at one of our seldom used campgrounds. On a patrol, our maintenance ranger found a burnt out car on one of the many sites. The desert is a weird place. He just calls the sheriff and waits. The sheriff arrives and it turns out there's a body in the driver's seat with no arms and no legs, just a torso and head burnt. The sheriffs just marked it as a suicide and removed the vehicle. We are close to Mexico and get a lot of illegal drug traffic coming through, so I guess they don't even bother trying to solve those. Super sketchy.
Number 10. An odd man in the woods. I was a park ranger on a small island, the only year-round resident. I loved the off-season with 400 acres all to myself, no phone, no internet. I was in the old forest one night when I saw a smear of bright white off trail ahead. I figured it was one of the small herd of white-rumped deer, but it moved up the side of the trail before I could get a better look. I heard a sharp bark and froze, then crept forward a few feet. I reached the fork and was straining to see ahead when I heard the crunch and crack of something in the brush behind me. I spun and saw a pale man, 6 foot or taller, with dark hair, wearing a bright white t-shirt about 30 feet in front of me. He gave me a lunatic grin, barked again, a hard, sharp ha, then turned and ran off into the woods. I stood still, scanning the trees, my hand on my weapon. After not hearing anything for a few moments, I backtracked my way to the main trail, then, terrified, sped walked all the way back to my cabin. I don't know who or what it could have been. The way he was running around off the trail convinced me that he knew the island very well, better than me for sure, and that he was hiding out somewhere, but I never found any evidence of a secret lair, and I never saw him again. Number 9. Small humanoid creature. This happened about 8 years ago when I was 21 years old and working as a camp counselor in New York State. The place is basically a bunch of cabins in the woods on top of a mountain, each cabin half a mile apart from the other, so you're pretty isolated in the woods. One night at about 1 a.m. I was sneaking off to meet my camp girlfriend. Suddenly I heard rustling in the woods and I stopped to investigate it. There are bears / other animals, so I was expecting something like that. Then this 3 foot tall humanoid type thing suddenly jumps out of the bushes and looks at me. It's too dark for me to make out any of its features other than it was standing on 2 feet, had 2 arms, and basically looked just like a miniature person without any features. I was curious to what it was, so I started walking towards it and it spooked, bolting back into the woods. I'll never forget how mechanical it looked as it took off running. I have never seen anything on 2 legs run that quickly, so I was pretty confused about what it was. As much as I tried to make sense of it, I still to this day have no idea what it was. It was very human, but too short to be a human, and I don't know how a human could run that fast anyway. Now, I feel like this could have been some sort of animal perhaps, but it's still creepy. Number 8. Crying baby. My grandfather used to be the equivalent of a park ranger down in Mexico. He was in charge of patrolling the farms and lands mainly due to people growing illegal substances. One day, he said he was patrolling this ranch late at night shift and he heard a baby crying. Now the land is pretty flat, so he looked all ways and saw nothing. He thought maybe it was some goats out in the far as they can sound like crying babies, but as he's walking his route, he hears the same sound, looks up in the sky, and swears he saw a witch with black clothing and everything flying towards a mountain. He panicked, ran to his car, and drove off as fast as he could. Now, this could have been a bird or something, but being alone at night outside, your mind can definitely play tricks on you. Number 7. The blue lights. I used to work as a ranger at Philmont Scout Ranch in New Mexico. There's a place on the ranch called Urica Mesa, and there's all sorts of local legends about it being haunted. One of the stories about the mesa is that at night you can see weird lights coming from the top. I've been there for 4 summers and even camped on top of the mesa and had never seen one until one night. A scout troop and I were camped on the back side of the mesa. I hadn't told them any of the haunted stories at this point when one of the kids points up to the mesa and asks, "What's that?" I figured he's seeing some flashlight coming down the trail from the mesa because I know there's supposed to be another group camping with us, so I tell him that. I turn to look and the lights weren't coming from where the trail is, they were off to the right and it's not a flashlight. It's like the light was coming from behind the mesa or from a fire that you can't see. Only it wasn't orange-red like firelight, it was blue. Creepiest thing ever because if the blue lights are real, what else is real? At this point though, I'm still thinking it's the other group, but like 15 minutes later, they roll into camp and we can still see the lights. Spooky. Number 6. Perfectly severed deer head found on trail. Ugh. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. A couple weeks ago, I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road and even further to the park boundary. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, no raggedness at the severance. Perfectly intact. Now, this is weird because I have seen wolf and bear spoils, and I used to find cougar prey remains in SD with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any of those things. The head was completely uneaten, eyes, tongue, everything intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. No catching, no droppings. Right smack in the middle of the trail, but again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers, plus why leave it in the trail? Whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me the chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clear deer head on the path. Now, this sounds like something straight out of a horror movie, and I am terrified. Number 5. Dead body. I was a wildland firefighter, specifically a hotshot for the US Department of Agriculture. We saw a lot of backcountry in national forests that no one ever saw. Once, on a fire in South California, we helicoptered deep into the woods, then hiked 8 or so miles. We were way out when we discovered human remains, clothes, etc. We opened the wallet and find a note, then found the thing he used with 1 bullet missing. We examined the skull and discovered the guy used it on himself. Very creepy in person. A crew flew out and investigated, piecing together his ID and missing person reports. They discovered he'd been out there for more than a decade. Number 4. Abandoned tent. The oddest thing was the abandoned camp next to the trail. Camping outside of designated campsites is a big no-no, and I was surprised as one day I was walking and found a tent set up directly next to the trail. The trail ran along a nice stream and was a very tranquil spot. Inside I found a cloth sleeping bag, some dirty clothes, lots of food, big cans of SpaghettiOs, and what looked like some leftovers from a refried beans and rice dinner, and a teddy bear. Everything reeked of cigarette smoke. I was reluctant to confiscate everything and leave the individual out there with nothing, but I did take all the food and pack it into a secure food storage box. I left a note explaining where I had taken the food and that they needed to move camp. Now, I was unable to return to the tent for 2 weeks, way too long to leave it sitting there next to the trail. It was basically untouched when I returned. Some trail crew folks had checked it out and let me know, but that was probably it. I packed up the rest and hauled it out. I spent some time poking around in the area, but never saw any other signs of life. It was obviously someone who was not prepared for camping out in the backcountry, judging by the food, equipment, and the teddy bear. I just don't know. Everything, clothing, gear, etc. indicated it was just one individual. Number 3. Moving light. Park ranger here. Another ranger and I were out on a search and rescue call once. The missing person was a man in his 20s. He had gone hiking and had not returned the day that he intended to. When we got the call, it was nighttime, but we hiked a few miles and set up camp on a ridge that had a pretty good view. He had gone into the woods prepared, so we decided to wait until daylight before beginning the search. About 2 a.m. I get up and I am peeing when I see a moving light at the base of the cliffs across the valley a few miles away. Looks like a flashlight beam. I tell the other ranger and we make the decision to keep waiting for daylight. The next morning we decide to check it out in the area and bring this guy home. We got to approximately where I saw the light the night before and started calling his name. Soon we find his body at the base of the cliff. He had fallen 60 feet on his head. The body was badly mangled. We radioed back that it has now become a recovery instead of a rescue. At this point, the other ranger yells at me to come look at this. Lying 20 feet from the man's body was his mag light. It seemed odd, but I thought nothing of it until the other ranger reminded me of the light the night before. It kinda gave me the creeps, but I still dismissed it. Before too long, the coroner arrived and inspected the body. After he took the body back to the lab, he said that the man had been dead for at least 48 hours before we found the body. All of a sudden, the oh crap alarm went off in my brain. I knew that it couldn't be possible. I had the coroner review his work, same results. I tried to find an explanation for the light I had seen, perhaps other hikers, but one search and rescue guy had stayed at the only trailhead in the area all night. No one had come or gone. To this day, I have no clue what I saw that night, but it freaked me out. Number 2. The mysterious stranger. I once led a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle schoolers and had one co-instructor. We were camping out on the top of the mountain and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. I laid on a hammock enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving on the trail. Bears are common in this area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man survey our camp. I could really only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes but may have been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do. I decided to wait it out. I waited, just staring at the man while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey the camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up on. To this day, I have no idea what that was all about, and it freaks me out. That freaks me out too. And coming in at number 1, search for hikers runs through super creepy clearing. There was a group that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return from a camping trip. A coworker and I headed out in the general direction the group had set off in. We'd been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point, and we start noticing odd things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, a children's stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. I noticed a bit of a shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close to the group, when a radio call comes in though. The group had been found 20 kilometers east of us and they're calling everyone back. So what did we find? I have no clue, but my coworker and I headed out of those woods fast, and yeah, I would too.